You're standing in the middle of your own house, and suddenly the person who raised you says you've got 24 hours to leave. No warning, no second chances, just a deadline. That's not a movie scene, that's real life. And when it happened to me, it wasn't just about losing a place to sleep. It was about losing the one person I thought would always have my back. This isn't just drama, it's survival. And what happened in those 24 hours will make you question everything you think you know about family. It was exactly 7:15 p.m. when the words cut through the hallway like a blade. You've got 24 hours to get your stuff out. That house is your stepfather's now. She didn't whisper it. She didn't soften it. She threw it at me like a verdict. And in that instant, the walls around me, the ones I thought were mine, felt like they belonged to someone else. I froze. My hands were still holding the dinner plate I hadn't finished. The sound of the TV in the living room kept playing like nothing had happened, but my world had just split in two. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't even sad. I was stunned. Because when your own mother tells you to leave, it doesn't feel like a fight. It feels like the ground beneath you just gave way. That sentence wasn't just noise. It was a countdown, a clock starting to tick. And I knew every second from that moment forward would matter. This wasn't a warning. This was an eviction notice disguised as family talk. And I had no idea what the next 24 hours were going to look like. 3 years earlier, things looked completely different. My mom had just remarried, and suddenly the house didn't feel like ours anymore. It felt like his. He came in with boxes of tools, a smile that seemed permanent, and a tone that carried more weight than it should. At first, dinners were polite. He'd ask about school, she'd laugh at his jokes, and I'd sit there trying to figure out where I fit in. But slowly, the balance shifted. Decisions that used to be hers started sounding like they came from him. What time the lights went off, how much water we used, even what food we bought, it all had his fingerprints on it. And I noticed something. Every time he spoke, her voice got quieter. I told myself it was just adjustment, that families take time to blend. But deep down, I felt the walls closing in. The house I grew up in was changing, and I was becoming a guest in my own room. That's when the first cracks started to show. Not loud arguments, not slammed doors, just silence. And silence, I learned, can be louder than anything else. By the time summer rolled around, the cracks in our so-called family were no longer invisible. They showed up in small, everyday moments, the kind you don't notice at first, but later realize were warnings. He started locking the fridge at night. Said it was about saving money, but I knew it was about control. Imagine standing in your own kitchen, hungry after a long day, and realizing you need permission just to eat. That's when I understood. This wasn't about groceries, it was about power. Then came the rules. Lights out by 10, no guests allowed, and every bill had to be justified. My mom didn't argue. She just nodded along, as if agreeing was easier than resisting. And every time she stayed quiet, I felt myself shrinking a little more. It wasn't one big explosion, it was a slow erosion. 1,000 tiny cuts that made me realize I wasn't part of the household anymore. I was being managed, not loved. And those months of tension were the silent countdown to the night she finally told me to leave. 2 nights before the ultimatum, the tension finally boiled over. It wasn't a screaming match, it wasn't chaos, it was a quiet conversation that turned into a verdict. He asked me for rent. Straight face, no hesitation. If you're old enough to work, you're old enough to pay. I told him the truth. I was saving for college. I thought that would explain everything. But he laughed. Not the kind of laugh that comes from humor, but the kind that cuts. College? You won't even last in this house. My mom was sitting right there. I waited for her to say something, anything, but she didn't. She just stared at the floor, as if silence was easier than choosing sides. And in that moment, I realized the argument wasn't about money. It was about control. He wanted me out, and she wasn't going to stop him. That night, I went to bed knowing something had shifted. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a place I was borrowing, and the lease was about to expire. The moment the words left her mouth, time slowed down. I didn't yell back. I didn't cry. I just stood there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. My hands were still holding a dinner plate, but I couldn't taste anything anymore. The sound of the TV in the living room kept playing like nothing had changed, but for me, everything had. I walked into my room and sat on the edge of the bed. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, each second reminding me that the countdown had already begun. I wasn't angry yet. Anger takes energy, and I didn't have any. I wasn't sad either. I was numb. Because when your own mother tells you to leave, it doesn't feel like an argument. It feels like the ground beneath you has vanished. I kept replaying her sentence in my head. You've got 24 hours. Not we'll talk about it. Not let's figure this out. Just a deadline. And deadlines don't negotiate. That was the moment I realized I had to start thinking about survival, not family. It's when someone you depend on suddenly withdraws their support, leaving you with shock instead of guidance. Research shows that sudden parental rejection can trigger the same stress response as physical danger. Your body literally goes into survival mode. That's why I couldn't feel anger or sadness right away. My brain was too busy trying to figure out, where do I go, what do I do, and how do I survive the next 24 hours? I walked into my room and stared at everything I owned. Clothes spilling out of drawers, books stacked on the desk, photos taped to the wall. Suddenly, all of it felt temporary. I had 3 bags, that was it. 3 bags to decide what parts of my life came with me and what parts stayed behind. The first bag was easy, clothes. Folded fast, no time to think. The second bag was harder. My laptop, notebooks, the things I needed to keep moving forward. But the third bag, that's where the choices hurt. I picked up a photo of my dad. I held it for a long time, wondering if carrying it would make me stronger or just remind me of everything I'd lost. In the end, I left it behind. Not because I didn't care, but because I couldn't carry memories and survive at the same time. Every item I touched felt like a decision about who I was going to be outside that house. And with each choice, the room grew emptier, until it didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a stranger's room I was borrowing for one last night. When people are forced to leave home suddenly, the act of packing becomes symbolic. It's not just about belongings, it's about deciding which parts of yourself you carry forward. Research on displacement trauma shows that these choices can shape how someone adapts to independence. For me, leaving behind that photo wasn't about forgetting my dad. It was about survival. Studies show that when people face sudden eviction or rejection, they often prioritize functional items over sentimental ones. And in that moment, survival meant choosing what kept me moving, not what kept me remembering. By the time the bags were half-packed, I knew I couldn't leave without trying one last time. I walked into the living room where my mom sat, her eyes fixed on the TV but not really watching. My voice shook, but I forced the words out. Mom, just give me one more week. Please. For a second, I thought she might look at me, might say something that sounded like the mom I used to know. But before she could even open her mouth, he cut in. No extensions. 24 hours. That's generous. His tone was final, like a judge slamming down the gavel. I turned back to her, hoping she'd push back, hoping she'd say anything to prove she was still on my side. But she didn't. She lowered her eyes, and that silence was louder than any answer. That was the moment I realized the confrontation wasn't about negotiating time. It was about facing the truth. She had already chosen her side. And I wasn't on it. Family therapists call this triangulation, when a parent aligns with a partner against their child, leaving the child isolated. Studies on step-family conflict show that once this dynamic sets in, the child's voice is often erased from household decisions. For me, that silence wasn't just painful. It was proof. Proof that I wasn't part of the equation anymore. And once you realize you've been written out of your own family's story, every word, every glance, every silence feels like confirmation that you don't belong. By the time the night settled in, I knew I couldn't just sit there waiting for the clock to run out. I had to figure out where I was going to sleep once those 24 hours were up. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts, staring at names I hadn't called in months. Friends, classmates, people I wasn't even sure would pick up. I sent a few messages, short and desperate. Hey, can I crash at your place for a few days? Some didn't reply. Some said they couldn't. And every unanswered text felt heavier than the bags sitting on my floor. I even looked up shelters online, places I never thought I'd need. The idea of walking into one terrified me, but the thought of having nowhere at all was worse. That's when it hit me. Survival wasn't just about packing. It was about planning. And planning meant admitting I was on my own. Every call, every message, every search was a reminder that I wasn't just leaving a house. I was leaving behind the safety net I thought family was supposed to be. And now I had to build one from scratch. For me, those hours weren't just about finding a place to sleep. They were about realizing how fragile stability really is. One sentence, one decision, and suddenly you're calculating survival like it's math. 3 bags, 1 phone, 0 guarantees. And that equation changes everything. The next evening, the clock struck 7:15 p.m., exactly 24 hours after she gave me the ultimatum. My bags were lined up by the door, 3 pieces of luggage holding everything I could carry. I stood there for a moment, waiting for something. Maybe a word, maybe a glance, maybe a sign that she didn't really mean it. But nothing came. I picked up the bags, one by one, and walked toward the door. The house felt different, colder, emptier, like it had already decided I didn't belong. My stepfather sat in the living room, arms crossed, watching me leave like it was a victory. My mom stayed silent, her eyes fixed on the floor. When the door clicked shut behind me, it wasn't just the sound of leaving. It was the sound of a chapter ending. I didn't cry. I didn't look back. I just kept walking, because looking back would have meant hoping, and I couldn't afford hope anymore. That was the moment I realized, sometimes leaving isn't weakness. Sometimes it's survival for me. Stepping out that door wasn't just about losing a roof. It was about losing the illusion that family always equals safety. And once that illusion breaks, you start building a new definition of home, one that doesn't depend on blood, but on trust. Weeks later, the shock had worn off, but the reality hadn't. I was sleeping on a friend's couch, my 3 bags lined up against the wall like permanent furniture. Every morning, I woke up with the same thought: this isn't home. But at least it was safe. I picked up shifts wherever I could, late nights, early mornings, anything that paid enough to keep me moving forward. The money wasn't much, but it was mine. And for the first time, I realized independence doesn't start with comfort. It starts with survival. There were nights I thought about her, about the house, about the silence that pushed me out. But the more distance I got, the more I understood. Leaving wasn't the end of me. It was the beginning of something else. I wasn't her daughter in that house anymore. I was my own person, building a life from scratch. And slowly, the pain turned into fuel. Every rejection, every unanswered text, every night on that couch became proof that I could stand on my own. I didn't just survive those 24 hours, I survived what came after. Months later, the chaos had settled into something quieter: reflection. I wasn't on a couch anymore. I had my own small place, barely furnished, but it was mine. And in that silence, I started to think about everything that had happened. At first, I blamed myself. I replayed every argument, every moment of tension, wondering if I could have said something different, done something better. But the more distance I got, the clearer it became. It wasn't about me. It was about control, about loyalty, about choices my mom made that I couldn't undo. And strangely, that realization gave me peace. Because once you stop carrying the weight of someone else's decisions, you start carrying your own. I wasn't her daughter in that house anymore. I was a woman building her own story. Looking back, I realized the ultimatum wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning. Painful, yes, but beginnings often are. Walking out with 3 bags felt like losing everything. But weeks later, I realized I hadn't lost. I had started over. A friend's couch became my first step toward independence. I found a job, saved money, and eventually rented my own place. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And that's when I understood. Family isn't always the people you're born to. Sometimes, it's the people who give you space to breathe, grow, and belong. That night my mom said 24 hours. She closed one door. But in the silence that followed, I found the courage to open another.